All right.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all our panelists for being here. Thank you to the Council for Strategic and Defense Research for organizing this panel. And thank you to our audience, whoever has joined and will be joining. So we're going to be talking today about the new nuclear dynamics in South Asia. It's been about 3 years since we've had the crisis, which was around the Balakot incident. That was the last major crisis, but very recently we had a cruise missile which was misfired from the Indian side. We've had different kinds of incidents on below the level of escalation to nuclear, but there are all sorts of different things happening right now. There's nuclear force modernizations taking place, new technologies coming in. And so this event really is to get a sense of where we are in the nuclear relationship between India and Pakistan. Different parts of the world right now are engaged in different kinds of conflict. What can we at this point of time say about where South Asia is with its nuclear relationship between the two powers, India and Pakistan? And for that, we have a stellar panel here today. I'm going to very quickly try and introduce this panel. First of all, disclaimer, I will not be able to cover the entire bios of each of these people, which is long and distinguished. So I'm just going to give you a very brief introduction to each of them, and we'll go into the content of our discussion today as soon as possible. So first of all, we have with us Dr. Tanvi Kulkarni, who is a policy fellow at the Asia Pacific Leadership Network, APLN. She's also a visiting fellow at the Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies and a visiting lecturer at the Department of Defense and Strategic Studies at the Savitribai Phule Pune University. Dr. Kulkarni has a PhD in diplomacy and disarmament from JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, and her thesis examined why states in a nuclear dyad negotiate confidence building measures. Next with us, we have Dr. Mansoor Ahmed, Senior Research Fellow, Center for International Strategic Studies. He's formerly a Stanton Junior Faculty Fellow and a postdoctoral research fellow, both with the Belfer Center at Harvard University. He's also held faculty positions at the Department of Defense and Strategic Studies at Quaid-e-Azam University and the Department of Strategic and Nuclear Studies at the National Defense University, both in Islamabad. Dr. Ahmed's new book, Pakistan's Pathway to the Bomb, Ambitions, Politics, and Rivalries, is forthcoming this summer, and we're, of course, all looking forward to reading it. Next with us, we have Ruhi Niyog, who's the director of the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies in New Delhi. She's also a research fellow at Harvard University's Belfer Center's project on managing the atom, as well as the International Security Program. Ruhi has led and designed a number of projects across the policy spectrum, and this includes the number of Track 1.5 and Track 2 projects. She also has a forthcoming book on global armed conflicts. And finally with us, we have Binish Pervez, who is a PhD candidate in political science at Brown University in the Department of Political Science. And she studies nuclear strategy and decision-making in the context of disruptive technologies, evolving strategic cultures, and international norms. She was previously a program associate at the Nuclear Threat Initiative and has also worked with the CTBT Youth Group, the UN Secretariat in the Department of Field Support, as well as a regional manager for Global Zero in South Asia. So with those introductions, I will first pose a question, and I'll go for initial remarks from all the panelists. And the question essentially is for the panelists, one by one, to sum up where they see the India-Pakistan nuclear relationship today, and what they consider to be the three main challenges to the India-Pakistan nuclear relationship. So first we'll go to Dr. Mansoor Ahmed, and over to you, Mansoor.
Thank you. So in my view, I think the India-Pakistan relationship continues to be fragile because there is a long history of conflict. There are outstanding disputes, and there is a lot of mistrust between both countries. But at the military level, I think arms race instability is one factor that is defining this relationship, and that is likely to continue for the foreseeable future. There are overlapping and evolving threat perceptions that is driving technological transformation and doctrinal shifts. And both countries are in the process of completing their nuclear triads and are pursuing escalation dominance strategies. However, the recent events have clearly shown that the onus of maintaining strategic stability is increasingly becoming Pakistan's responsibility in two ways. It continues to uphold its credible minimum deterrent posture and is exercising restraint in the face of irresponsible and belligerent rhetoric coming from across the border and posturing and irresponsible provocations. For example, Pakistan did not exploit Indian vulnerability during the Ladakh crisis. There was no military maneuvering on the Pakistani side. Pakistan chose not to strike military targets on February 27th in Operation Swift Retort. That was essentially a demonstration of political and technological capability of striking back to restore the status quo ante without actually taking measures that could have led to escalation. And Pakistan did not respond to the March 9th BrahMos incident that could have led to inadvertent escalation. But there are long-term trends that need to be seen in greater detail that I will talk later.
Right. Thank you, Mansoor. Let's go to Tanvi next.
Thank you, Debok. So sort of to carry over from what Mansoor said, in the last 5 to 10 years, we see that India-Pakistan bilateral relations have been at a low point. There have been heightened exchange of firepower on the disputed border, breakdown of any kind of bilateral dialogue, a number of military crises, in fact, and at least one of them that Mansoor and Debok, you yourself mentioned, where we had a hint of overt nuclear threats and brinkmanship being manifested, with very few options for de-escalation through bilateral mechanisms. At its core, the India-Pakistan conflict continues to remain a territory and sovereignty-related one. The two countries speak a different political language on history, geography, and geopolitics, and this more or less informs their nuclear relationship as well. At the level of the nuclear dyad, the India-Pakistan equation is that of, I would say, deterrence dissonance. That is, they're seeking to deter each other differently. So India seeks to deter Pakistan's nuclear attack, and Pakistan wants to deter an Indian conventional and nuclear attack. Moreover, Pakistan's nuclear deterrence is designed to be India-specific, as it often is claimed by Pakistani scholars and officials. So while there is a formal deterrence relationship between India and Pakistan, it fundamentally stands on this kind of doctrinal asymmetry, which is informed by their threat potential for each other. We see that in the initial phases of the India-Pakistan nuclear relationship, and I'm talking of the 80s, 90s, and the early 2000s, we noticed that an India-Pakistan crisis or a confrontation would be followed by a period of de-escalation and risk reduction through CBAM. In my assessment, that has changed today. And that's because of two reasons. A, the change in political context and strategic priorities for both India and Pakistan. And second, and more importantly, the change in the normative context of the global nuclear order itself. So over the years, India has prioritized economic development and growth as an important driver of security, and has also sought for itself a bigger role in the emerging Indo-Pacific geopolitics and its manifestations, which include geopolitical blocks like the Quad. For India, China has emerged from being a major competitor to being a major strategic threat. And India in this looks at Pakistan as a spoiler, notwithstanding the legitimate security threats that the India-Pakistan conflict poses. But we see that India is less hesitant to take the military action against Pakistan. On the other hand, Pakistan keeps missing the bus of economic growth and is largely consumed by political and geopolitical considerations. At the same time, the normative context has changed in the global nuclear order. We're talking about nuclear equations between 9 nuclear powers being more entangled than ever. Sometimes this is represented by the phrase nuclear chain. But also the current normative context is also that of a weakened non-proliferation regime and active conflicts that involve nuclear powers with little multilateral restraint mechanisms to fall back on. We see a nuclear order which is increasingly relying on self-deterrence. In fact, in my assessment, see the transition between the Cold War normative context and the post-Cold War normative context of nuclear behavior has never been so stark as it is now. On the other hand, in terms of the non-proliferation regime, we also see that there are two normative frameworks at work today. One is the NPT on one hand, and the other, of course, is the TPNW, the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And India and Pakistan are not formally party to either of these. Having said that, these new normative contexts bring with themselves legitimacy questions, new legitimacy parameters on the possession, proliferation, and the use of nuclear weapons, which nuclear armed states, including India and Pakistan, will have to deal with and engage with. So that sort of sets the context for the nuclear relationship between India and Pakistan for me. In terms of the main challenges that I see for the India-Pakistan nuclear relationship, they would be, like I said, the deterrence dissonance or the doctrinal asymmetry, which continues to impede a stable nuclear deterrence equation between the two. Of course, the lack of political dialogue and communication, which is perhaps the single most important factor for de-escalation if a crisis erupts. And of course, the imminent dangers of accidental nuclear explosion during active hostilities or active conflict, which then brings our attention, of course, to safety and security issues of nuclear weapon systems. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Tanvi. Let's go ahead and go to Ruhi, and then we'll go on to Binish.
Thank you, Devok, and my thanks to CSDR and Dr. Jacob for the invitation. So I find actually that I'm more or less in agreement with my co-panelists, and what I'll try to do is supplement what they've said with some big picture thoughts before I imagine we're going to delve into the brass tacks as the discussion moves forward. So this sort of replicates the template that both Mansoor and Tanvi have adopted. So what I'll do with my time right now is flag a few general observations actually in response to the two excellent questions you've posed, Devok. And my first thought is, as scholars and analysts, we have two functions. We try to shape and prioritize a policy agenda for the government, if it is so amenable, and or we reflect the government's policy priorities in our work. By which I mean, we focus on the same subject matter, if not the same direction. And in this perspective, from where I sit, I think the India-Pakistan nuclear relationship is both on the policy back burner and the policy analysis back burner. Now, moving on to what could be motivating, this lack of attention, and I think there could be a number of factors. To my mind, for example, allocating bureaucratic priority and resources to other foreign policy issues and regions that may be of more immediate concern. I think it could also be fatigue. We know that these are by and large issues that even many of us have been working on for a long period of time without any considerable positive policy movement. Or it could be, the lack of perhaps a thorough acknowledgement of new subject areas that are in circulation for research and analysis, which then sort of helps me segue into the challenges section of your question, which again, I don't know if I would characterize these necessarily as challenges, at least my responses. I would rather call them observations. And these are observations that I have sort of collected over a period of time of the nature of the field itself and how that can then sometimes impact our own work negatively. One, I find that nuclear policy itself operates in its own little silo. And I feel like this is a discussion I've had with some of you at least over different points in time. And it tends to do this at a distance from the broader geopolitical or international security domain that it inhabits. And this is, of course, true not just of India and Pakistan, but nuclear issues in general. And I find that this is quite a unique feature of this particular field. And I certainly haven't encountered other subject areas that tend to be quite this aloof from its environment and from its circumstances. I do feel that this can in fact limit our scope of analysis, and it can also make it less dynamic. And very honestly, I find this a bit puzzling because, the nuclear policy discourse, not least the possession of nuclear weapons, that both shapes and is shaped by larger foreign policy choices. So whether it is, and of course, I recognize that there is an acknowledgement of this in theory, but I'm not sure to what extent this tends to translate into practice. So I do feel that there is a need for us, both as analysts and perhaps at the policy level as well, to actively link how we think about nuclear issues, foreign policy, and global geopolitics, so that the incentive to discuss the specific aspects we are looking at today, that doesn't arise only when a nuclear issue comes up explicitly, or it becomes relevant from a policy perspective, or if there is a crisis. In addition to this, my second observation would be, of course, the obvious, which is that there is no high-level political dialogue between India and Pakistan. And there is no indication at this time if and when such mechanisms will resume. And this is another feature of the observation or challenge, if you will. And nuclear dialogue, we know, is an essential element of this. And the lack of active official communications, in my view, has knockdown effects both on its policy deprioritization, and here, of course, I'm speaking of the nuclear equation, as well as its role in scholarly discussions such as this. So I'm deeply appreciative of the fact that, you put this panel together. And without any value judgment here, for as long as India and Pakistan continue to hold on to their common minimums for the resumption of talks, which is to say India focusing on cross-border terrorism and Pakistan on Kashmir, we are basically talking apples and oranges. So there is unlikely to be a meeting point between the two, and therefore perhaps, at least I don't see a potential opening in the foreseeable future, unless there is something else that incentivizes this kind of opening. And we can see how this kind of political climate can also, of course, hold our own work hostage. And one example being how India-Pakistan track 2s have come to a grinding halt. This used to be a very populated space, but isn't sadly anymore. In addition to these two, I'll make a third and final observation, and this is actually tied to my previous point, and this has to do with perception, which is to say perception gaps and perception management. Now, any good foreign policy and foreign policy analysis goes beyond merely being self-referential to accounting for a thorough understanding of, the other's motivations or how the other perceives an adversary or its adversary, in this case, India. So without dialogue, of course, this is bound to suffer setbacks. And I think communications, therefore, are critical to the bilateral relationship and the nuclear enterprise. And again, I'm stating the obvious here, but I think it is especially important in an environment of adversarial relations and of ambiguity. I understand that there is a back channel right now between India and Pakistan, and I do think that demonstrates that the importance of talking to each other is acknowledged at the highest levels of government. And I, of course, have no information on how active it is or how substantive the discussions are. But I do think it is still a cause for optimism. And I imagine this bit, which is talking for the sake of talking, is perhaps going to come up for discussion later. I hope it will come up for discussion later. These are my three very broad observations, Debok, and I think I will end here. And I'm happy to pull out different elements as we move forward. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Ruhi. And we'll definitely have questions from the content of your initial remarks as well as the others. So I encourage the audience members to put down their questions in the Q&A box, which is there. And after we are done with the second and third rounds of discussions, we'll open up the question Q&A to the audience. So you can raise your hand at that point as well. But I encourage you to type in your questions in the Q&A section. So let's get to Binesh and hear her thoughts on the initial questions. Over to you.
Thank you, Debak, and thank you to the center for inviting me to be on this panel. As the most junior scholar on this panel, I feel incredibly inspired to be among you guys and have this kind of dialogue and discussion. I think it's very important, and I am really looking forward to the interesting things that we talk about today. I know I'm going last, so I might repeat some of the things, but I think these are important things to talk about. So forgive me for doing that, but I'll try to be as succinct as possible and try not to repeat what others have said so far. A quick summary, I just want to talk about the evolving dynamics. I want to highlight some of the other aspects of that have come up in terms of the evolving nuclear relationship that we might also want to talk about later. And then obviously talking about the challenges that I see are the biggest ones or are the most important ones to for us to be discussing as a group today. As you've all mentioned and alluded to, that since their demonstration of nuclear capabilities, both India and Pakistan have had, this increased risk of war with cross-border arms buildups, and we've failed to sustain a long-term peace dialogue. And these two neighbors have a history of fighting several bloody conflicts, and the mere suspicion of covert support from militant attacks has brought them to were on the verge of war in the past. Interestingly, the mistrust is so deep that when we even capture and convict pigeons who cross borders and on suspicion of being used for espionage. So that's how I like thinking about the level of mistrust that we have as neighbors. Obviously, the nuclear element of this rivalry has become more pronounced over the years, and we need to realize, like a lot of you said, that these are countries that have long-standing border disputes, and it's not only India and Pakistan, but we have to consider the broader triangular relationship between India, Pakistan, and China, which I hope we get a chance to talk about more in terms of thinking about the triangular deterrence relationship between the three states and how that impacts the signals that we send to each other and the especially with respect to the force modernization aspects. Of course, we don't need to go back into history, but for me personally, in my reading of this evolving relationship, one critical juncture that has marked a shift, at least from the Indian side, after the election of the Modi government, was a government that adopted a much more muscular policy against Pakistan, and that has resulted in a change in the level of, or a change in the characteristics of the conflicts that we've more recently seen, which maybe, like all of you again have alluded to, have been a little bit more escalatory in nature. The 2016 Uri attacks, where I find it really interesting that, two states have completely different narratives on this situation, and we still live with that, and we move beyond that without any significant escalation from that point. The Pulwama and 2019 Pulwama crisis, again, is a significant one. We've talked about it a lot, but I do want to mention that the fact that, India chose to have their INS Arihant submarine, which can carry nuclear capable ballistic missiles, fully operational and deployed at the height of the standoff, was also a concerning factor that we should maybe talk about a little bit more. And while these limited attacks and targeted strikes have not merited an all-out conventional retaliation and skirted well under the nuclear threshold so far, we can argue that the nuclear restraint is arguably waning. Other more recent occurrences that I find interesting, and I think maybe we can, they're useful to classify in this broad array of confrontations that are happening, is the recent Pakistani claims that they've detected and blocked Indian submarines in their waters in October 2021. They say that this is the third time they're doing this, and this is part of their, long-range maritime patrol that has prematurely detected and thwarted attempts by the Indian submarine from entering the Pakistani waters. Again, this account is disputed by the Indian side, and I think maybe we can talk about again the narratives and the perceptions associated with all these occurrences, but it also begs the question of paying more attention to the maritime confidence building measures and the rule of engagements in order to prevent accidents and miscalculations in this new arena in this new theater that's becoming more and more competitive. Again, you've already mentioned the BrahMos cruise missile that was accidentally launched into the Pakistani territory. I think some aspects of that we should discuss a little bit more is how long it took for the notification from the Indian side to come. The hotline was not, according to some reports, the hotline was not used. And the fact that, different reports have attributed this particular instance to either human error, to technical malfunction during the course of the routine maintenance. And some are even like speculating that, the launch was an intentional act to gauge Pakistan's war readiness or the ability to track the missile. So again, a lot of different narratives coming up, but this has important implications for how we see the future of Pakistan-India relations, specifically in the nuclear realm. So very quickly, like this is obviously an evolving dynamic. Some of the recent occurrences that I think are important to think about, but the major challenges, firstly, I think it has to relate to the next question we're going to get into in a lot more detail, which relates to force modernization. Both India and Pakistan continue to build up their nuclear stockpiles and are, constantly engaged in diversification of their delivery vehicles and platforms with multiple like ranges, destructive power, and there's a lot that we can need to flesh out there in terms of what this means for the future of strategic stability in the region. I would want to argue, I don't want to, we can talk more about this, but I do want to say that, it's hard to say that these technologies have a singular effect. They do have some positive effects that can, stabilize relations in some ways, while on the other hand, they can also weaken deterrent stability. And we can go into detail of those issues. But I personally think that the alarmism associated with these developments might be too premature, and we need to think more carefully about how these technologies are operationalized, as well as what are the policy incentives and the strategic preferences driving these decisions to adopt these specific technologies and deploy them in certain ways. So definitely want to talk about that. The second aspect, which has come up, all of you said, is communication, lack of communication. So we don't like to talk, we don't talk to each other. When we talk to each other, we misunderstand each other. And then when we also talk to each other, there's a lot of disruptions and distractions. So you all have mentioned that the process of dialogue is stalled, even though the Lahore Declaration and the composite dialogue have created a lot of like hope at one point in time for peaceful settlements of disputes. These foundations have fractured over time, and we need to really think about like, do we need a completely new way to approach strategic dialogues in this realm, or can we still savor some of these old foundations that have been somewhat successful in the past? We also need to think about like domestic politics in this context, and in terms of the rhetoric that's being used on either sides about how we think about each other as rivals, and what are the prospects of peace. I think, and when we say in terms of communication, last thing I would want to mention is thinking also about like social media and about within the recent crisis, like how information and a lot of information and a lot of propaganda has informed views of how these crises should end. And does that really matter? And I think that's an important aspect to look at. The third thing, and I promise I'll stop after this, is trying to think about the unique ways in which our situation as India-Pakistan is different and unique. And it operates in a very unique kind of strategic environment, and how we as scholars need to be more careful about adopting reference frameworks that have been informed especially through the Cold War experience. There's a lot I can say on that, but thinking about how we communicate with each other, how we think about deterrence, how we think about strategic stability as a concept, how broadly we think about it, I think those are all aspects aspects that we need to develop some knowledge that is more informed by our own experience, our own regional experience. So that is something I do see as challenging. And I hope that, with conversations like these, we can continue to make progress on that specific issue. And with that, I will end, and thank you again for having me on this panel.
Of course. Thank you so much, Binesh. And it looks like we've got a number of challenges that are flagged. This is a huge list. I was taking note, and I could list it out, but I won't at this point of time. What I will highlight is that it seems like we have, even in periods of time that we are not actively engaged in hostilities, we have a number of challenges which could potentially lead to escalation. So it's a very unstable piece, is the sense that I'm getting from the comments of our panelists. So we want to delve in a little more into some specifics. So in this second round of discussions that we're going to have, I want each of the panelists to talk about what the main technological developments on the Indian or Pakistani side are that they consider to be the most concerning for strategic stability. We've talked about the political side of things a bit more in the first round, but let's talk about some of the brass tacks of what are the technological developments that we see to be concerning. Are there technological developments that make you sleep better at night? Because it all seems like a doom and gloom story at this point of time. So over to the panelists. This time around, we'll go in the reverse order. So we'll come to Binesh first.
Oof, that's a hard topic to go first on, but I will try my best. So forced modernization and key technological developments, especially those characteristic of what some scholars try to relate to this third nuclear age, are challenging and need to be talked about more. You can argue that they can complicate deterrence calculations and then also subsequently heighten pressures to maintain strategic stability in the region. Like I was mentioning earlier, there are promises and then there's perils of these technologies, and it's hard to give out a blanket statement about how all of these will affect strategic stability. And I think we need to do more careful research looking at these technologies at a more granular level, how they're deployed, operationalized, and then try to think about these issues. On the one hand, nuclear states see the value in adopting these non-nuclear technologies as they offer new ways to defend against or attack an adversary's nuclear systems and provide a more flexible range of options while operating under the nuclear threshold. But on the other hand, this reliance can also create, new risks of miscalculation, inadvertent escalation, and as may increase the temptation to launch counterforce attacks that can that can threaten a country's second strike capabilities, which again, it can be very destabilizing. In the case of South Asia, there's a plethora of technologies that I can talk about. And they, range from advancements in dual-use weapon systems, as well as more general technologies and capabilities like AI, cyber weapons, autonomous weapons, hypersonics, precision-guided munitions, drone technologies, nuclear-powered submarines. So there's a lot. But to try to give some sort of, I was trying to think about it in a more structured manner for myself. And the kind of four main buckets that I came up of technologies, I think that there might be that I think about as concerning or having opposing effects is firstly developments with regards to the sea-based deterrent that I was mentioning. So thinking about the commissioning of the nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarine INS Arihant and the submarine-launched ballistic missile K-15 Sangarika. This has significant implications for altering the strategic balance in the Indian Ocean as it opens up a new avenue of confrontation. Again, this can be understandable to some extent because this can enhance the most survivable leg of the nuclear triad. However, from the Pakistani perspective, this move can be perceived as threatening because developing such capabilities pushes against the boundaries of this declared nuclear policy of credible minimum deterrence, which we can also talk about what is credible, what is minimum, how do we both understand each other, and where the mismatch is. So mentioning, and also I want to mention the intermediate range K for SLBM, which was recently in 2020, officials announced that it was successfully tested. This is concerning because it has a really good, some officials have commented on the circular error probability of these weapons and has stated that these are ideal weapon systems for a sea-based counterforce capability from standoff range. So again, implications that we need to think about in terms of counterforce capabilities. Pakistan has successfully launched its nuclear-capable Babur-3 submarine-launched cruise missile. The expectation again is that this allows Pakistan to enhance its credibility of its second strike capability, which can help strengthen deterrence, which is good, which is what we want. However, like the earlier analysis that I was speaking about in terms of the Indian Arihant, the SLBM, such capabilities can both stabilize and destabilize the nuclear balance in some ways. Because it rests on assumption that these forces are indeed survivable and invulnerable against modern anti-submarine warfare, which is, again, we can get into the whole plethora of how much technical advancements have been made in that specific realm. But again, the answer is not very clear, which is the uncertainty is what we need to be worried about. The second bucket is non-nuclear and dual use weapon technologies that can create issues of entanglement. There's a lot I can talk about, but just to review the list here, thinking about hypersonics, drones, anti-aircraft systems, these are all capabilities that, again, are maybe some of them are more nascent stages of development, but can have significant effect on the future of strategic stability on both sides. I'm not going to go into a lot of the details. The third category that I think is interesting to look at is technology associated with the fourth industrial revolution, including advances in cyber and AI-enabled technologies. So these technologies can have, have significant consequences specifically for the nuclear command, control, and communication capabilities and critical infrastructure associated with that. So happy to talk more about AI and cyber. I love talking about those technologies. But the last one I would say that I'm worried about, I want to talk more about, is just technologies that enhance posture of full spectrum deterrence, specifically a little bit more thinking about the Pakistani end. These include a range of capabilities like battlefield nuclear weapons, dual capable cruise missiles, sea-based cruise missiles. Again, while they offer more flexibility at one end, which can help be stabilizing, they can also heighten strategic uncertainty in the threat environment, which we need to talk about. How do we reduce that uncertainty by communicating more with each other and making sure that there's obviously no accidental and accidents and no miscalculation that happens while using these technologies. So yeah, I will end with that. And sorry if that was a long rant on a long list of technologies.
Not at all. Thank you so much for this comprehensive. The 4 buckets are a good way of thinking about the different kinds of technologies that we are dealing with in this nuclear and strategic stability related space. So I'm definitely a little bit more worried after these comments, but let's go over to Ruhi and see if there are any positive developments that could give us some succor, but let's see.
I'm sorry, Deepak, I'll have to disappoint you. But I will also say that, Binish has given such an impressive overview of everything that I don't have very much of a role to play. But the one thing I will add, and this is something she touched on, Binish, you touched on in your earlier remarks as well, which is, I am concerned about, and I'm also interested in the role and use of digital information technologies. I've done some research on this, and my research has looked at the role of, how the media and public opinion may advertently or inadvertently shape or constrain crisis decision-making. And in turn, you look at how a government obviously seeks to control narratives, public narratives in times of crises, and has the option to do so as the chief arbiter of information in crisis situations. And while my work on this now needs some updating, I think there is immense scope for future and further research here, because this is where things like misinformation, disinformation, etc., come into play. One of the things I do recall is, for example, Prime Minister Modi is saying in the aftermath of Pulwama, "Hum muh toh jawab denge," which is to say, we will give them a befitting reply. And of course, he was responding to the domestic public clamoring for an appropriate riposte to Pakistan. And what this makes you wonder is, the ways in which this sort of thing could create commitment traps, in future crises for any political leadership. Another thing worth thinking about is how a muddled security environment could contribute or have consequences for escalation. And of course, then we also have the lack of access just to verifiable facts in these moments of crises. So this is something that I expect to be keeping an eye on in the long term from my own research perspective. That was very short. I hope that's fine.
That's perfectly fine. Thank you so much. We do need to talk a little bit more on the role of disinformation and what the role of the public is in the relationship, in the strategic relationship between India and Pakistan on the nuclear front, but also in general on what effects these domestic publics have on foreign policy. So let's put a pin on that for now. We'll come back to that during Q&A. Let's go to Tanvi, and then we'll go to Mansoor. Over to you, Tanvi.
Thank you, Deb. Thanks, Bob. I'm glad Dinesh made that very elaborate expose, because a lot of what I was going to say sort of overlaps with what you said. Thank you, Ruhi, for also bringing in the element of disinformation technology. What I will do actually is to sort of take this question the way Ruhi engaged with the earlier question, that is to, in many ways, question the question, if I may, Bob. So technology and strategic stability and India-Pakistan nuclear relationship. So we've seen that over the last 80 years since the beginning of the nuclear age, very little has changed in terms of the fundamental way in which a nuclear bomb explodes. There are constant changes in the way to deliver that nuclear payload in terms of the range, in terms of the platform, in terms of the size, and allied technologies that either directly affect or indirectly impact nuclear weapon systems. So we're talking of course, AI, cyber, space weapon technologies, etc. And today, there are far more disruptive technologies, say, in the domain of space and cyber, which need to be considered. But with every new technology, there is, of course, a tendency to sort of look at that technology first in a threatening fashion, because of the element of unfamiliarity when it comes to new technology. So you don't really know how the use of that technology, what is the end result of that, the use of that technology. And as Dinesh pointed out in her remarks, that disruptive technology, new technologies can either strengthen deterrence or it can depreciate deterrence depending on the role that is assigned to those weapon systems, defensive, offensive, counter value, counter force, etc. As far as the India-Pakistan nuclear relationship is concerned, I think the fundamental reality is that the biggest concerning factor would be in terms of technologies that require either country shifting to more ready nuclear forces. So not just battlefield tactical use nuclear weapons that Pakistan has in its arsenal, but also hypersonic weapons, sea-based nuclear capabilities, etc. But coming to the question itself, you use the term strategic stability. My question, or sort of my reflection, would be on the concept of strategic stability itself. How do we understand strategic stability in the new context of the global nuclear order that we have? Is strategic stability still dependent on nuclear stability? Are we equating strategic stability with nuclear stability, which was the case during the Cold War? And if we are not, then we're clearly looking at strategic stability, which moves beyond the terms of parity and nuclear vulnerability. So the question to ask is, in the larger scheme of things, is Russia looking at mutual vulnerability with the US? Is the US looking at mutual vulnerability with China? Is India looking at mutual vulnerability with China. So my sense is that the concept of strategic stability itself is changing. Of course, new technologies have a role to play in how that concept of strategic stability is changing. We see that there's sort of a shift that is taking place from the understanding of mutual vulnerability to nuclear stability, to strategic stability, meaning more guaranteed security. So sort of there is a blurring of the line between the offensive and the defense. And this is visible through vertical proliferation, modernization of nuclear forces, and emergent technology. So in the new strategic stability context, there are some powers who are looking at it in terms, still taking it in terms of do numbers matter, while there is an increasing understanding that strategic stability definitely goes beyond just a question of numbers or just the question of even qualitative parity. So, so sort of my question to this question would be is, how are we understanding strategic stability? When we're saying strategic stability between India and Pakistan, are we essentially looking at within the narrow framework of the nuclear dyad? Or are we looking at strategic stability in which India and Pakistan are very much a part of not only dyads, but triads or the larger nuclear chain? This is sort of just to inject a bit of more discussion into this question. But I'm sure Mansoor will have will be able to answer this question better.
Thanks a lot, Tanvi. Those are very insightful questions. The question of what is strategic stability really, whether nuclear has to be a part of it necessarily, and this question of conventional developments perhaps also being a very important factor in strategic stability. So maybe we just don't have to look at nuclear. So of course, I'll turn it over to Mansoor to give us the answers to some of these difficult questions. Over to you, Mansoor.
Thank you. So at the risk of repetition, my view is that South Asia is on the verge of a third nuclear age. But in addition to that, there is also a revolution in military affairs that is going on with the introduction of strategic non-nuclear weapons, which have been mentioned earlier by the other panelists, including standoff weapons, as were witnessed in the 2019 crisis, the Pulwama Balakot crisis, used by both sides. Canisterization of ballistic and cruise missiles. I think that is pretty destabilizing. And most importantly, the introduction of dual-use counterforce capabilities on both sides. Specifically, the BrahMos-A that is being inducted and integrated with the Sukhois under India's SFC, and the Nirbhay and so many other systems. And that, as has been mentioned earlier, brings the question of conventional nuclear entanglement and the discrimination problem. And India is also now known to be on the path to raising a new strategic rocket force in pursuit of its non-contact warfare capabilities. And both India and Pakistan have been investing quite a lot in developing the whole gamut of precision strike complexes. And in addition to that, India's pursuit of BMD capabilities coupled with the counterforce capabilities, this appears to be a recipe for deterrence failure. In addition to that, I'd like to clarify Pakistan's full spectrum deterrent posture. Generally, the understanding is that Pakistan's full spectrum deterrent posture is only nuclear specific and is only centered on the short range, low yield Nasr weapon system. The full spectrum, by definition, as was demonstrated in 2019, involves the conventional deterrence. And I'm just going to elaborate on that in a while. So the full spectrum needs to be holistically understood. I think it has been miscommunicated by scholars and officials for almost a decade now as a warfighting doctrine. I think it's simply a whole range of conventional and nuclear capabilities that are designed to close any room for limited conventional conflict. And a host of technologies are available on the menu to Pakistani planners to deter aggression at all levels. Having said that, I think the most important thing that needs to be taken into account is that the conventional asymmetry between India and Pakistan is narrowing down. It is decreasing thanks to India's two-front challenge. And I'd just like to elaborate here that in terms of the Air Force, for example, the Indian and the Pakistani Air Forces are almost at parity level right now. If you look at the types of aircraft, the sortie generation capability, the pilot to aircraft ratio, the serviceability of the two different platforms that are available, and the numbers. The number of squadrons on each side, for example, Pakistan has about 25 squadrons and India is at about 33 squadrons, which of course includes some legacy platforms on both sides. In land forces, Pakistan already enjoys superiority in self-propelled artillery, and is already building on that capability. I think both countries are adding rocket artillery that can carry out precision strikes on both sides. And given the two-front challenge, I think there is virtual parity. I think Arzam Tarapo has written about it. Samir Lalwani just wrote about it. And I think this requires an in-depth evaluation of what exactly are the available military capabilities on both sides. I think the parity has already, in Pakistan and India are both on the cusp of that situation where there is almost parity. Navy was an area where Indian Navy had enjoyed overwhelming superiority, both in terms of numbers and in the types of ships and submarines. But Pakistan Navy over the past few years is embarking on the most ambitious force modernization plan in its history. In all domains, surface ships, submarines, anti-submarine warfare, A2AD capabilities. And by 2030, the gap is going to narrow down to about 1:2. So India will not be able to dominate the Indian Ocean the way it has been projected as the net security provider. And that is going to have implications on the Indo-Pacific strategy. The US is banking on the Indian Navy to police the Indian Ocean. And it's really going to be very difficult for India to ignore Chinese presence in and commit all its resources against Pakistan during a conflict. So there is also a two-front challenge for India at sea that is about to emerge during this decade. And moving on to that, I think because the conventional gap is narrowing down, both in terms of numbers, both in terms of new types of counterforce capabilities, and of course the qualitative modernization of conventional forces and delivery systems on both sides. I've been a proponent of the thesis that India is now going to rely more on its latent nuclear potential, which is where India enjoys a clear nuclear edge in terms of the stockpiles of fissile material. Currently, the estimates of stockpiles are simply insufficient to meet the force goals that India is pursuing, both against China and Pakistan. It might be sufficient against Pakistan. It's not going to be sufficient against China. If you look at India's joint doctrine and land warfare doctrine, this was before the Ladakh crisis. So the thinking was very clear that India will be pursuing escalation dominance strategies against Pakistan while trying to deter China. But after Ladakh, I think the situation is becoming more complex. And that is where we need to focus attention on. India is going to pursue a dual-track counterforce strategy, which will include conventional counterforce for precision strikes, for decapitating precision strikes, and also a buildup of strategic nuclear forces, for which, as I've said earlier, India has enormous amounts of fissile material. But even a conventional counterforce strike in terms of the risks against Pakistani strategic forces is definitely going to be escalatory. A conventional BrahMos strike or a Nirbhay strike during a crisis against Pakistani strategic forces, command and control, or critical targets will lead to nuclear escalation instantly. It will lead to retaliation from Pakistan. Because Pakistan is a smaller country and it has a smaller nuclear force. So, of course, the risk of acceptance on that side is going to be lower. And of course, I think China is, from a Pakistani perspective, has been a great equalizer and a great factor of stability in terms of bringing in parity between conventional parity between India and Pakistan, both in terms of the force deployment of forces, the postures, and the force modernization, the conventional force modernization on the Pakistani side. And this is, as I've said earlier, is going to have implications for the Indo-Pacific strategy. It's quite strange that successive iterations of the US Indo-Pacific strategy simply doesn't talk about Pakistan, as if Pakistan doesn't exist, as if its military capabilities do not matter. And I'm talking about conventional military capabilities. So I think in the final analysis, while Pakistan is also modernizing its nuclear forces to retain a credible level of minimum deterrence, and will continue to do that so that the balance is not doesn't become unstable beyond a certain point. So the other side doesn't think that it has some kind of false sense of superiority. I think Pakistan at the moment is an overmatch for India, even without the Chinese threat. So a two-front war is simply going to stay a pipe dream for Indian planners. India doesn't have that kind of force capability to take on both countries at the same time. And that will bring us to the way forward. All right, so where are we going to, where are we heading? The risks are going to continue. They are going to become more complex because of the new types of technologies coming in. But I think it's in India's interest, as much as it is in Pakistan's interest, to pay attention to the composite dialogue proposals that Pakistan has put forward. It is again on the table, and to resort to dispute settlement through negotiations. It is in India's interest because that is the only way they can, India and the Quad can focus on exclusively on the Chinese threat. There is no other way. The Indo-Pacific strategy is going to fail if the India-Pakistan equation is not settled through peaceful means.
Thank you very much, Mansoor. Those are very insightful comments. And this question of why Pakistan isn't there in the Indo-Pacific strategy or in discussions of the Quad is actually a very interesting one. I don't think we've heard a very good answer to this earlier. So I'm going to pose this question maybe later on to some of the other panels and see what they think about the possibility of two-front war and whether the technological advances on the Pakistani side and the Indian side and potentially parity is actually a good thing. Because conventionally we think, well, this is all a recipe for disaster. So it seems to me that you're claiming that's not necessarily the case. So we'll see what the others think of it when we come to Q&A. I'm going to go to the third round of questions with keeping an eye on time. So let's go around, and this time around, we'll go in the original order. And I'm going to ask you, what is the scope, given that we've now heard where politically we are at in the India-Pakistan relationship? We've also heard technologically there are some destabilizing factors, and perhaps there are some stabilizing factors. But what is the scope for CBMs in this context that we are having this discussion? What is the scope for CBMs for India and Pakistan in the nuclear relationship in particular? And would any of you have any particular proposals, one or two that you have in mind, that are actually actionable and might be worth considering given where we are between the two countries? So I'm going to go to you first, Mansoor.
I'm pessimistic about prospects for CBMs. I think standalone CBMs, I think the Stimson Center did a fantastic study on off-ramps. I think standalone, there have been brilliant ideas out there, but are they practical? are they acceptable to decision makers on both sides? I think the broader question is that unless there is a willingness for dispute settlement and conflict resolution through negotiations, that is the key. That is going to essentially decide the fate of any particular set of CBMs that one might propose. There has to be an understanding, like as I said earlier, Pakistan is still open to moving forward on the composite dialogue process, but successive proposals by Pakistan have been rejected by the Indian side. And that is precisely because the Indian decision makers, the political leadership has been, in my particular view, there is a self-image of India being a great power. It is a rising power, but and then the notion of a net security provider for the region at the cost of the threat perceptions and securities of other neighboring countries. I think Indian planners and Indian decision makers and leadership doesn't have the kind of incentives that would sort of force them to rethink their paradigm towards the region. But as I've said earlier, the developments that are occurring on ground in terms of technological transformation, ultimately the Indian side will have to factor in that there is no other way except to move forward with the composite dialogue process. You can suggest any number of CBMs, but they will only be practical and they will only be acceptable if there are incentives to for them to be accepted by the leadership. And I think time is not on India's side in terms of how China, the power differential and the military power differential along the line of actual control and Pakistan's own force modernization. I think the sooner Indian planners realize that it is better to engage with Pakistan politically, settle the Kashmir dispute, the better it is for all parties. And I think the Chinese have also been, as far as I can remember, starting from Kargil, they've never openly advocated any change in the status quo between India and Pakistan, at least. Of course, I'm aware of the dynamic between India and China, and I will not comment on that. I'm not well versed on those dynamics. But I think they've been, and the United States also has been encouraging dialogue. So there is hubris, there is a lack of political will to engage with Pakistan. And I think that is the key that scholars and analysts need to highlight. That is the only way forward. Otherwise, we can keep going in this action-reaction cycle of technological modernization and escalation dominance strategies and trying to reinforce the communication of capabilities on either side with a view to compel the other side to, either come to the negotiating table on their terms or to continue with compelling strategies, which add to instability in the region. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Mansoor. I'll go to Tanvi next. And the question here, I mean, apart from looking at CBMs, another question that's coming up from what Mansoor said is, what really is the role of other parties? What is the role of third parties in the possibility for CBMs at all? Do we need a China on the table before we can have a nuclear dialogue between India and Pakistan? What is the role for the US in this context, given everything that's going on with the Quad as well, and the US-China rivalry? And we can't necessarily be talking in a vacuum. So I'm just going to flag that for our panelists to consider as they're talking about some of the CBMs that are possible. So over to you, Tanvi.
Deepak, as we know that India-Pakistan have already have a formalized bilateral confidence building measures portfolio. And in fact, quite different from other nuclear weapons countries. India and Pakistan have had confidence building measures even before they became overt nuclear powers. While this portfolio exists, both countries, I believe, still see value in retaining the existing CBMs. And a lot of these CBMs are essentially crisis avoidance measures or crisis management measures. This portfolio doesn't really include crisis de-escalation measures or risk reduction measures. Both countries, of course, are reluctant to add new CBMs. India insists that the Lahore CBMs have not been fulfilled yet, and Pakistan insists that there is a need to go beyond the Lahore framework. But having said this, to a large extent, I agree with Mansoor that while existing CBMs are of great value, I've been of the opinion that the scope for new CBMs is quite low. And this is not so much because there is a political will that is lacking, while it is a factor. I do feel that one of the reasons why CBMs do not go ahead is also because, like you said, we tend to sort of shoebox the India-Pakistan nuclear relationships within as a regional dynamic. On the other hand, this relationship is largely playing out at the global level. So we do see that the kind of norms, the kind of practices for nuclear risk reduction that take place at the larger global level sort of do percolate at the India-Pakistan level as well. So we can definitely talk of bilateral India-Pakistan CBMs and they suggest formalizing low alert levels for crisis stability. Of course, the recommendation of political and military dialogue always stands. The recommendation for discussing nuclear doctrines always stands. But having said that, we do need to broaden our conversation to look at CBMs at a more multilateral level and how India and Pakistan can fit into that multilateral confidence building nuclear risk reduction regime. So, and as to your question of, I believe the discussions on the two-front war and the role of external actors, we can take it during the discussions. I do have a lot to say, but let's, I think, first listen to Ruhi and Dinesh on CBMs.
Thanks a lot, Tanvi. That sounds good. Let's go over to Ruhi next.
Thanks, Debok, and I'm sorry to disappoint you again, but there's pessimism across the board. I'm going to echo both Mansoor and Tanvi. I'm reluctant to propose new things because I'm not convinced that going the distance, between an environment of no official dialogue to then launching CBMs would stand any test of feasibility. I can think of some more modest, in my opinion, goals. And some of this actually draws from a recent in-person nuclear track 2 that I was at a couple of days ago that also had Pakistani participants. And incidentally, this was a few days after the accidental missile launch. So as you can imagine, we had a lot to talk about, especially on the issue of crisis communications. And this sort of has been a leitmotif through this entire discussion, right? And we were, by the way, on complete agreement about the necessity of crisis communications. And the thing to emphasize here is consistency, clarity, and timelines. We talked about the DGMO's hotline, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe it was used during the Pulwama Balakot incidents. I think Dinesh mentioned that it wasn't utilized during the missile launch. Of course, we did have occasion last year when the DGMO hotline was used to announce the ceasefire. So I suppose we can take that as some kind of a good sign. And another thing to flag here would be the so-called nuclear hotline, which is the Foreign Secretary level one. My my point of view is that confidence building measures cannot be launched into an environment that has been absent of dialogue altogether. Communications and consistent communications are critical. And these communications also cannot be effective in crisis scenarios if there is no precedent, recent precedent or set practice for it. So I would think more in terms of baby steps if we are thinking from a policy relevance and policy reality point of view. And just to add, in response to one of the things that you flagged, Debok, about the potential or the interest in mounting a dialogue that also brings China on board. And I would say certainly at the track 2 level also, this would be of great interest from the point of view of discussing the trilateral nuclear equation. Thank you.
Thanks, Shuri. We'll go over to Binish, but before we do, I'll just flag to the audience that we are approaching Q&A time. So if you could put your questions into the Q&A box, which is the bottom of the screen, that would be great. And we'll go to your questions as soon as we start the Q&A. So, all right, with that, over to you, Binish, for your thoughts on CBMs.
I came in a little bit more optimistic than the other panelists, but I do agree with a lot that has been said so far. I do think that ultimately political will and leadership is what is going to dictate the success and practicality of anything that we are discussing here. I do think that it still does help to think about this issue a little bit more creatively and trying to think about different ways that maybe, we can be more convincing of certain approaches. I know that on a practical level, there's a lot of issues with the current political leadership not wanting to come and talk at all, and all the previous panelists have mentioned, to bring something out of a vacuum and try to start a process out of a vacuum seems a little bit it doesn't seem like it's going to happen. However, I do think that there is still some, in the past, there are instances where, we have come together, and, there are some examples, including the agreement on the prohibition of attack against nuclear installations and facilities, the Lahore Declaration and a Memorandum of Understanding. There's some, again, foundations that we can, again, think about more critically and think about what was present at that moment that made those specific agreements or negotiations successful, and maybe can we try to replicate some of those environments or some of those dynamics. I do think that the complication associated with third parties is an important one to think about. India, especially post 1971, has taken a very strong stance against third parties brokering any sort of resolution between India and Pakistan. And this is a little bit concerning given the regional dynamics and the kind of, again, like I mentioned, the triangular kind of relationship that we share. So ignoring China or not paying attention to that aspect is maybe not going to be, again, a very practical thing to do. Having said that, I did was trying to think really hard about ways that we can approach CBMs, and one way I was thinking about is there something that we can salvage in what already exists and try to either build upon it or try to think about it in terms of invigorating it with new energy or incentives, or the right kind of incentives to make people be more willing to implement them more with more sincerity. So thinking about the 2005 agreement on the advance notice of ballistic missile tests, that was an agreement that was passed in 2005. Adding cruise missile flight test notifications to that is something again something that can just be added to that, and maybe it's a low-hanging fruit, but maybe we should think about it. I was also thinking about the 2007 agreement on reducing the risk from accidents related to nuclear weapons, which I believe that expired in 2012. Again, it did not. Okay, so my understanding is a little bit limited on this, but I don't know what the current standing is and how specifically with this specific incident that happened, like why wasn't it enforced more prominently? Do we know more about it? I guess why wasn't it? I would like to actually hear Mansoor. He's nodding his head, so I would love to hear more thoughts on that. I also think that thinking about CBMs in the maritime realm is something interesting. And if there are, I know that in the Lahore Memorandum of Understanding, there was something about incidents at sea agreement. So delineating maritime boundaries more specifically. So how can that kind of be re-envisioned in today's context with new nuclear technologies? And is there a way to, like, again, put more energy into existing CBMs and try to think more creatively about how to invigorate more energy or political will, or give new incentives to motivate people to follow them. The second is trying to think about like new technologies. There is some nascent research, again, this is more like from the Western scholars, about how actually governing new technologies, especially cyber, it is more successful if you do it in the earlier stages of their development. So I don't know how much of that like actually implies to our context, but thinking about these new realms, cyber and AI, again, we do have the 1998 agreement on the prohibition of attack against nuclear installation facilities. Can we add on that to include nuclear attacks? And also trying to think about, if extending this to cover other critical nuclear infrastructure as part of the nuclear complex, such as nuclear command and control systems, including early warning systems and, computer systems. Is there willingness to do this? I am not sure, but I think it's, again, something that can be mutually beneficial, and we can make a good case for. I was interested in looking at that. And similarly, in the realm of AI and autonomous systems, again, these are newer technologies. We know less about what the consequences are going to be. There's more uncertainty. So maybe creating standards right now in a much more earlier stage about information sharing and notifications about AI-enabled systems that make inadvertent conflict less likely. It might be a window of opportunity. Again, don't know how practical it is, but I've been trying to think about ways in which we can think about it. Lastly, I also want to, I don't know, again, this is a question I want to pose to like the panel and more generally, but is thinking about CBMs, like how limiting it is? Can we think more broadly about norms that can be, that diffuse more, more permanently and are internalized in a much more sustainable manner than just thinking about CBMs that come out of like one crisis situation and then we just like, don't really have any long-term plan of like actually making it sustainable and like trickle down into the psyche of decision makers. This is a question I have, and I'd love to hear more thoughts on it. But that was my general thought about the CBM's question. But yeah, feeling pessimistic overall.
I thought you started off very on an optimistic note, and midway through your comments, I was like, okay, here's a host of things that could potentially be done, but then eventually you veer towards the consensus of having a negative outlook towards the possibility of CBM. But I think the last question should be flagged to the other panelists as well on, is CBM as a framework a limiting framework inherently? So we have about 12 minutes left. What I'd like to do is see if we have any questions, and we do have a couple of questions already. So I'm going to get to the Q&A and get an audience question going first. I have a bunch of questions which I'll abuse the moderator's privilege and ask after the first question. But for any other individuals who want to ask questions, please go ahead and type them up in the Q&A box. So All right, actually, before I get to that question, I see that Ruhi has a raised hand. So let's go to Ruhi first, and then I'll ask the question.
Oh, no, I'll come back to this later. And I just want to quickly apologize. I had to get away for reasons already explained. I'll come back later then. That's fine.
No worries. Great. All right. So the first question is for Mansoor. And the question is, if counterforce developments on either side have the potential to adversely affect deterrence, how differently does this manifest from traditional counter-value systems and doctrines? Some have argued that the fulfillment of a counter-force operation depends on complete destruction of the adversary's nuclear arsenal. Isn't this then a strategic sort of attack? This may be deemed improbable, if not impossible. So the question is to you, Mansoor, if you think that counterforce developments actually adversely affect deterrence and how differently it is from having counter-value capabilities.
I think neither India nor Pakistan has the kind of ISR capabilities to take out and destroy each other's nuclear forces completely. In the traditional literature, counterforce between the Soviet Union and the United States was like taking out each other's strategic nuclear forces. In the Pakistani and Indian situation, I think counterforce is more relevant to counter-military targeting of deployed systems on both sides and probably command and control. Counter-value weapons are weapons of last resort for any nuclear weapon state, at least in the South Asian context, even though Pakistan is a first use doctrine, unofficial doctrine. There are certain circumstances that will trigger the first use. It's not going to be abrupt. And the development of counterforce, battlefield counterforce capabilities are escalatory. Because, as I said earlier, there are certain conditions that have to be, there are certain thresholds that have to be crossed before Pakistan launches a first strike. And the conventional or dual-use counterforce capabilities are escalatory because they can trigger one of the thresholds. If any Pakistani command and control is targeted, deployed strategic systems in the field, short-range systems, mobile launchers are targeted during a crisis, and if there is a popcorn event, even if it is a conventional counterforce strike, Pakistan will retaliate with nuclear weapons, is likely to retaliate with nuclear weapons. If there is there is an attempt to decapitate a large portion of the Pakistani Navy surface fleet or air bases in a first massive salvo, like India is amassing a huge arsenal of BrahMos and Nirbhay cruise missiles, and is also working on hypersonic systems. So that can be perceived as a decapitating strike by Pakistani decision makers. And depending on the crisis dynamics, that can lead to a counter strike of equal or more magnitude. And they, at the time of the Balakot crisis, when India had threatened missile strikes, the Pakistanis had threatened that they would carry out 3 times the number of strikes, and had for the first time talked of the quid pro quo plus policy of responding to anything that comes across the border. So that is why counterforce is destabilizing, because there is a discrimination problem between conventional, whether an incoming missile as a conventional warhead or a nuclear warhead, and even otherwise, I think modern conventional supersonic and hypersonic systems have the potential of triggering vertical escalation, because they can potentially produce the same effects as battlefield nuclear weapons if they are used in large numbers, especially against strategic targets during a crisis.
Thank you very much, Mansoor. I'll come to you, Ruhi, but before I do, there's a question which is aimed at you. So let me give you the question as well, so we'll have your comments to that as well. So the question that's been asked of you is from Dr. Happyman Jacob, which is that you've mentioned that, talking about the nuclear issue being discussed in silos. And what Dr. Jacob is asking is, isn't it a good thing that it's being discussed in silos, because then it's not being linked to all these other areas of foreign policy that politicians and policymakers keep talking about. So is it a good thing to keep nuclear aside and not really have people talk about it other than in an off-the-cuff sort of remark? Is it important for us to be incorporating it and have it become more accessible in our dialogue, given that that leads to potentially escalatory outcomes as well? So your thoughts on that and your other comments.
Thank you, Debok. And I thought you reformulated that question really well. I've actually written out an answer to Dr. Jacob on the side, but very briefly, I will explain again how I was coming at this was from the point of view of policy analysis, which tends to be at an arm's length distance from the environment that it operates in. And I think for nuclear knowledge production, right, we need to be able to expand the scope of how we do research and what perspectives we employ to come to whatever conclusions we come to. I think that can help potentially bring fresh perspectives. And I think it is also important, for example, this has been a personal grouse for me for a long time, which is the issue of nuclear security. Right? We see nuclear deterrence as a vertical. We see nuclear safety and security as another vertical. But as we are seeing play out in the invasion of Ukraine, nuclear security can become entangled with the broader context of escalation in advertent and inadvertent ways. So I think there is an argument to be made for the scope of discussion to expand at the policy analysis level in ways that could then support policy formulation without the policy elite necessarily having to not look at nuclear in silos. I think it's perfectly acceptable and perhaps even a good thing that they do. And keeping these off-the-cuff sort of remarks aside, and we can see what sort of damage that could lead to. I think there is, as I said, an argument to be made in terms of supplementing and better informing policy by mounting a wider lens on the issues that we discuss. And just, as something as trivial as how we identify ourselves. We are identified as nuclear experts, right? But we can't be nuclear experts without understanding international security and foreign policy. So we are, in fact, international security experts who also specialize in nuclear issues. But people tend to also keep us in that silo. And I find that not conducive sometimes to our work and engagements. A question here actually for our Pakistani friends, perhaps two. In terms of the Indo-Pacific that you brought up, Mansoor, and by the way, really enjoyed listening to you. I thought you made some really provocative remarks that is certainly going to push our thought in hopefully interesting ways. I want to understand a bit more what direction you were heading in with, your remark about the non-inclusion of Pakistan in the Indo-Pacific strategy, vision, concept, whatever you'd like to call it. And my counter question to that would be, is Pakistan interested in, being included in that narrative or even adopting the terminology of the Indo-Pacific? That's one. And the second one, and this is both to you, Binish and Mansoor, and Binish, your remarks as well, that whole laundry list of technological developments that you put out. I couldn't keep up while I was taking my notes. Hopefully there'll be a recording later. I thought that was brilliantly done. Both of you, I think in different ways, made the point that over a long period of time, there have been attempts by both sides to convey in the public domain the sort of developments that are taking place in terms of nuclear modernization, etc., whether directly or indirectly. Specifically, Mansoor, you made reference to full spectrum deterrence and how there have been several attempts to break this down, but it still continues to be misinterpreted. So do you think then there is deliberate misinterpretation on both sides to justify the direction in which modernization is moving in? And if that is the case, which is deliberate misinterpretation, then what is the scope for dialogue? I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruhi. We're almost out of time, so I'm going to sort of flag another question that's come in from the audience, and I'll then give it back to Mansoor and Binesh to answer the questions that have been posed to you by Ruhi very quickly. So the question that's been asked is, what is the best theoretical lens to explain India and Pakistan nuclear equation? Is it just a neat one-on-one nuclear deterrence relationship, or can you think of nuclear deterrence between India and Pakistan without thinking about the larger South Asian strategic triangle with China, and then, of course, incorporating the US-China relationship into thinking about it? So is there a theoretical lens which can help us think about the India-Pakistan deterrence relationship better? So with that, let's go over to Binesh first, and then to Mansoor.
Mansoor can go first. He had like 3 questions he has to answer, and he's much more.
All right, very quickly, we're right almost out of time. So very quickly, your answers.
All right. So I had mentioned that Pakistan had been omitted in the Indo-Pacific strategy, not in terms of wanting to see Pakistan as part of the Indo-Pacific strategy, but in terms of India being projected as a net security provider and the linchpin of the Indo-security strategy, as if Pakistan doesn't exist. As I mentioned earlier, Pakistan is already an overmatch for India, 1-to-1, in terms of conventional forces. India simply doesn't have the decisive edge. It has superiority in certain areas, but the kind of decisive technological military superiority that a country has to overwhelm the adversary simply is not there. And if you factor in the two-front war situation, I think Pakistan might even have superiority in certain areas. That was my point, because the American planners are completely banking on India's ability to contain China without realizing the regional dynamics of how those regional dynamics are going to play. And I think this is also relevant to East Asia. I mean, there are other sub-regional dynamics that are at play, the Japanese and South Korean relationship and how they view China, and of course, North Korea, etc. And I was that was the context in which I was making that point, and also specifically in terms of Pakistan's own naval modernization, and how that is going to factor in, and that's going to divide India's resources and attention in a future conflict, when the PLA Navy will also be a major player in the Indian Ocean region. And of course, given the PLA's enormous shipbuilding capabilities, they can probably have, they can sit out a battle of attrition in a long drawn out conflict. The other point was full spectrum. I think it is deliberate. It was designed specifically, initially, Pakistani statements, official statements were designed to counter the cold start threat. But later on, the literature became embedded around the Nasser missile. And there is much more to Pakistan's strategic options than just the Nasser. That had a very specific purpose. That was to plug the gap at the tactical level at short range. There are no battlefield nuclear weapons, I think. And FSD was also projected as a war-fighting strategy. It has never been a war-fighting strategy. For a typical war-fighting strategy, a country would require very large amounts of fissile material. India probably has that. Pakistan does not. And India has also been introducing its own nuclear-capable battlefield range systems, the Prahar and the Pragati and other systems, and the Prale. And the DRDO is also talking of the Pinaka being nuclear-tipped at some point, et cetera, et cetera. And if India were to go for battlefield nuclear weapons, India has the amount of fissile material to do that. So FSD was just a full range of capabilities that Pakistan had. And from 60 kilometers to 2,750, that was India specific only. And the idea was to give a message to the Indian decision makers that there is no gap in Pakistan's deterrent posture that you can exploit and then launch a limited war. So that has a very specific purpose, and that is completely India-centric. And within that, of course, Pakistan will continue to upgrade the credibility of its deterrent posture. I think on both sides, what the minimalism that was taking precedence over the credibility, that is now that has been taken over by the credibility rather than minimalism in the doctrines. If you look at how the doctrines or the postures or the statements were being talked about in 1998, both countries were talking of minimum credible deterrence. Then it moved on to credible minimum deterrence, and then Pakistan's full spectrum, and India talking of limited war. Now, if you read the land warfare doctrine, the language has changed further.
Thank you very much, Mansoor. Is there anything you would like to add to that, Binish?
I agree with that. Someone asked about the strategic lens, like the right theoretical lens. I think we need to develop our own lens of looking at this kind of a specific, unique relationship. It's obviously like, this triangular relationship. Some people call it a quadrilateral relationship. They involve US in it as well. Some people look at it as nuclear chains of different dyads, and like there's different ways we can approach this question. So I think it's up to us to think about it this more creatively. And I think discussions like these push us further to think more creatively about how to measure deterrence relationship in such a unique setting. So yeah, and Mansoor has something to add to it, so you should definitely get it.
Yeah,
Sure.
sorry. I just wanted to make a quick point. I think doctrines, the first thing that will go out of the window when a conflict starts is the doctrine. The kind of capabilities that both countries are adding, conventional, dual use, and nuclear, I think will give them sufficient operational flexibility to do as the situation requires and to respond to the situation as and when it takes place. I've even suggested, even more provocatively, that India might be the first to go nuclear if things don't go its way during a conflict. And India's deployment of the Arihant during the Pulwama, deploying a second strike platform preemptively when there hasn't even been a full-scale conventional war, speaks volumes about how an actual conflict might unfold in South Asia. And that is one reason why we need to look at the risks of irresponsible posturing and irresponsible rhetoric and then playing to the gallery for domestic political purposes. And I think also, finally, command and control dilemmas, the recent Ramos accidental or intentional fire, whatever it was, I think it is extremely destabilizing, because if it was not for Pakistani restraint and responsibility, things could have gotten out of hand. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for those comments. Any final word from Ruhi or Tanvi before we wrap up? Yeah, Tanvi.
Thanks, Devok. So very quickly to the question on the theoretical lens, theory allows us to take multiple lenses, which is great. I feel that as far as India-Pakistan are concerned, because there is an active bilateral conflict, it is important to look at the India-Pakistan conflict in terms of a nuclear diet, so that we can identify triggers and drivers of the conflict that eventually can lead to nuclear escalation. But at the same time, I do agree that just this lens is limiting in if we had to speak of strategic stability. And that also sort of answers Dr. Jacob's question earlier, that it's important to sort of look at China into this equation. I strongly believe that it's important to talk in terms of this trilateral conflict, whether we look at it as a trilateral or we look at it as two asymmetric dyads which cohabit the same geographical space. But a lot of things throw up when we look at that. Similarities, differences in nuclear postures. For instance, India and China have a very similar role of nuclear weapons. And so I think this understanding will also sort of address a lot of our concerns about the two-front war, which we didn't get to discuss at this point, but I hope there will be some follow-up session where we get to discuss it. And very quickly to your question of, is CBM a limiting framework? I would say no. I think our understanding of CBMs has been quite limited because we sort of keep thinking of CBMs from the Cold War era. I think instead of throwing the baby out of the bathwater, it's important to sort of give a thought to what kind of CBMs do we want in this new nuclear reality that we live in. CBMs are just the first step, so it doesn't make sense to sort of to throw them away. Thank you.
Great. Any final thoughts, Ruhi?
None. Thank you, Deepak. In
Thanks.
fact, that
All
was
right.
my final thought.
Thank you very much. Well, this has been an extremely rich conversation. I had tons of other questions and it sparked off a lot of different thoughts. So thank you all the panelists for this rich, comprehensive, provocative, and insightful conversation. Thank you to CSDR for creating this forum and allowing us to have this exchange. I want to thank Dr. Happyman Jacob, Dr. Gaurav Saini, and Manu Sharma in particular for organizing and putting this together. So thank you all, and let's hope that we find another forum to talk about these things in greater detail soon.
Thank
All
you.
right, bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Deepak, for moderating it as well. It was great. Thank you.
Thanks,
Brilliant, Deepak.
Thank you.